We're going to reconvene our meeting and shift gears and take up H-126, an act relating to community resilience and biodiversity protection. First witness is Karen Horn. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Karen Horn. I'm with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, and I'm here to testify on H-126. I did send a map from the Trust for Public Lands that was put together in August 2021 to the committee that sort of inform our testimony. I don't know if you've seen other maps at this point, but that's the one that I had available. Pulling up layers on the GIS map, but with my home internet is really not a possibility. So, yeah, so we do support the concept that effective and efficient contributions to conserving biological diversity and maintaining a landscape resilient to climate change is to conserve intact and connected ecosystems. We agree that supporting landowner education, technical assistance and programs, conservation easements to promote forest management, and fee acquisitions of property will all contribute to climate resiliency and biodiversity. Those are some of the goals that are in your draft of H-126. We also agree that housing is an enormous and equally immediate crisis, which every currently sitting legislator campaigned on the need to resolve. The identified need for housing is 40,000 additional units, according to the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. According to the map that's provided by the Trust for Public Lands, lands currently conserved, quote, with some level of legal protection equal 1,655,279 acres. The goal of 30% conserved, according to that map and their definitions, is 1,800,046,218 acres. The additional acres that would need to be conserved to meet the 30% goal, according to the Trust for Public Lands map, is 190,000 acres. We are concerned, or curious maybe is a better way to put it, about what the geographic representation or distribution of that acreage is across the state. Is it evenly distributed across the state? The TPL map includes current and completed Trust for Public Land projects, federal, state, and local land, private conservation land, and the Appalachian Long and Catamount Trails. I'm not sure what a map would show as conserved if the criteria were, quote, meeting the definition of ecological reserve area, biodiversity conservation area, or natural resource management area, as defined in this section, which is section 3 of your bill, H-126. And I would note that you also define in your definition section, you define sustainable forest management, but it's not actually used anywhere else in the legislation. So I'm not sure what the intent is with respect to sustainable forest management. The TPL map does not show, and H-126 would seem not to count the following areas of land that are off the table for development as a result of statutes, rules, and regulations, such as steep slopes, lands above 2,500 feet elevation, wetlands and wetland buffer areas, shoreland protection areas, lands in the use value system, waters of the state, certain floodplains, deer yards, and areas conserved pursuant to permit agreements with the state or Act 250 permits. We strongly suggest that you will need a full accounting of conserved land before legislation is passed, establishing future conservation goals. The primary purpose of legislation at this point should be to collect all of that comprehensive picture of all protected areas in the state from all varieties of protected restrictions. You can use a lot of the data that is with the GIS Center. I hope you are going to have them in to talk about the different layers of protected lands that they can show you. We contrast the land that's already conserved, 1.7 million acres, and the 30% goal of 1.8 million acres, with the acres that, according to discussions around housing, should be available for that purpose. According to the Department of Housing and Community Development, all designated areas in the state comprise 41 square miles, or 26,240 acres. Those are the compact settlement areas in which housing should be located according to the goals of the state and the state designation areas, if housing can be permitted in those areas. And that's a big if, given the constraints on the permitting of housing, opportunities for appeal, costs of construction, lack of labor, and a host of other issues. We've been working with the Senate Economic Development, Housing, and General Affairs Committee on legislation that we hope will amend not only local zoning statutes, but also Act 250 and additional state permits. We're also supportive of H111 in the House General and Housing Committee, which would address workforce housing, and you have H68 here in your committee. We do think that the need for conservation to protect biodiversity and assure resiliency in our communities and providing 40,000 critically needed housing units can be met. We believe they cannot be met in isolation from one another, and that H126 needs to acknowledge the present housing crisis. I'm happy to take any questions, and I will send this to the committee. And I would urge you to take a look at that Trust for Public Lands map.
Thank you for your testimony. Representative Sedalia.
Trust for Public Lands. We have not heard from them, have we? Did we hear from them?
Not yet.
Okay.
We were going to invite them in.
Okay. And can you, are you familiar with that structure? Can you just tell me a little bit about what that is?
What the Trust for Public Lands is? It's a national nonprofit that is engaged in helping to conserve lands across the country, and they have an office here in Vermont. I mean, they've done excellent work, but that was the map that I could find that represented, conserved lands on one statewide map.
Okay.
Are you set? Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks for coming in today, Karen. So I'm not necessarily hearing that you don't support this. It sounds like what you support is to do a full accounting, which frankly, I think that's what this is. I mean, this is a plan essentially to look at all what we have, what we don't have, how, what the tools are in the toolbox. To me, it sounds like what you're asking is make sure as you're thinking about that planning process that you're also bringing in the lens of housing. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, partly. So we're not supporting the bill at this point in time. We think that the bill needs to be specific, that all kinds of protected areas, whether they're protected as a result of purchase or conservation easements or regulations such as wetlands. Wetlands, you can't build in wetlands. They're a huge proportion of the geography of the state. you need to look at those kinds of regulatory restrictions as well when you're coming up with the total acreage that's conserved in Vermont. And we think it's very important that this bill also acknowledge the need for housing in some respect and speak to the 40,000 units. We find the fact that you've got 1.7 million acres conserved at this point and 26,000 acres, which are where you're encouraged to build housing, is pretty out of balance, to be perfectly frank.
Representative Stebbins.
Thanks. I guess in my experience, regulations can be changed. And so if what we're really looking at is something really set aside or not, I don't know that. I mean, I just think about, like, not necessarily in Vermont, at the federal level. I mean, we have regulations this way, 4 years later, we have them this way, then we have this way. And so I guess I would push back a little bit and ask you your opinion if you really see regulations as being permanent.
Well, you can also change any statute, and this legislature has in the past. You could change any statute at any time. We think that the regulations that protect some of these kinds of lands and waters, such as the wetlands, the steep slopes, the elevations over 2,500 feet, they've been in place for decades, and they've expanded, not contracted. So we think it's really important to look at those lands. If you wanted to say conserved lands, category A, regulatory protected lands, category B, you could differentiate that way, but we think it's very important to include those lands. It's an incomplete picture otherwise.
Thank you.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. 30-30 and 50-50 is part of this resilience, H126. I believe you had a map here that showed different, or maybe it wasn't your map, but somebody that showed different parts of the state that are a certain percentage that are trying to achieve this. And the Northeast Kingdom is 43% and Chittenden County is 8%.
That does get to the issue of geographic distribution of protected lands.
Sure. So do you think that this bill is going to be concentrating on mostly the Northeast Kingdom because that's the only place to conserve what's left?
Oh, well, Central Vermont's a good place also. No, Southern Vermont. But I think there certainly is a risk that those lands, well, it's going to be easier to conserve lands where there's less pressure for development, and essentially the costs of acquiring or conserving are less. So it's unlikely, in our opinion, that Chittenden County would end up with the bulk of those conserved lands.
That's my thoughts as well. All right. Thank you.
Representative Sibilia.
So one of the things that I've been kind of tuning in on as we've been talking about this are definitions. So I've heard you talk about protected versus conserved, and we have permanently conserved, which is something else, I think. But can you tell me what you believe the difference is between protected and conserved?
So the bill would define conserved lands, and it has these three categories of lands that are considered conserved. So ecological reserve areas, biodiversity conservation areas, or natural resource management areas. But protected is my word. It's not, I don't believe, defined in the statute, certainly not in the bill. But what we mean by that is those areas that are off the table for development because of things like rules and regulations and agreements with Act 250 permits and those kinds of things.
Okay, so I just want to, I don't know that the bill defines conserved as those three types of land. I think it defines those three types of land as permanently conserved, but I don't know if it defines what conservation is. Is that the case? Is that the case?
It has a definition of concern. Those
It
added.
does.
Yeah.
Okay. Conserved, there it is. Oh,
Is that
Yes, it
section
does.
3?
yeah, okay, it does. So conserved means permanently conserved.
And just to follow on that, Representative, is that the definition of sustainable forest management is in the bill, but what's the context in which that is going to be used? Because it's not referenced when you get farther down in the bill. I could,
That is, Karen.
pardon, the definition, well, in your definitions section, it has sustainable forest management.
Yes, it does. Okay, great. Some reason, okay. I missed. Definition. Thank you.
Further questions? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Molly Mahar. Welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning on H-126. I'm Molly Mahar. I am president of the Vermont Ski Areas Association. We're a nonprofit trade association representing 20 alpine and 28 cross-country ski areas across Vermont. And ski areas are not only major economic drivers and employers for the rural communities where most of them are located, but skiing is also an important part of the state's tourism, heritage, and culture. And ski areas have successfully conserved and protected lands through master planning and careful management to benefit our state, its natural resources, and the environment over many decades. Ski areas are part of Vermont's working landscape. We are stewards of the land, and the managers take this responsibility very seriously, spending millions of dollars in planning and permitting to accomplish this to support our recreation economy. Outdoor recreation is an important gateway for many people, both Vermonters and visitors, to understand the importance of our environment and why it should be protected. Skiers come to the mountains for recreational opportunities, certainly, but also to experience the mountain environment, and we strive to manage that environment properly so that people will continue to visit and the capacity to support and promote outdoor recreation will be enhanced. We broadly support the goals of H-126 and believe that a more diverse and connected ecosystem is more resilient, that conserved and managed lands can help to mitigate climate change through carbon storage and sequestration, and that maintaining habitat connectivity in Vermont is key to maintaining habitat connectivity for the region. That said, we want to make sure that you understand some of the unique characteristics of the environment in which ski areas work and the issues that we are focused on for the future. Vermont ski areas exist on privately owned lands, state lands, and federal lands, and often combinations of private and state and private and federal land. And while Act 250 governs the use, development, management, and protection of lands where ski areas operate, often state and federal land use policies govern their management as well. And a great example of that is ski areas that operate on or partially on state lands must file, seek approval for, and manage 2 annual stewardship plans. And the same is true for areas on federal lands. So ski areas are managed using an array of tools, which include permanent conservation by fee ownership or easements by the state or the U.S. Forest Service, or as you heard from ANR last week, through Act 250 and ANR permitting processes, which impose conditions that govern ski area operations. We support the use of the widest array of conservation programs and tools be used towards achieving the goals in H-126 because the regulatory process does provide significant protection for the lands, wildlife, and plant species that are on private, state, and federal lands where ski areas operate or adjacent to where we operate. And last week you heard from Mr. Austin, excuse me, from the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife, who indicated that the department, working with ski areas through Act 250 and A&R permitting processes over many decades, has resulted in significant permanent conservation as well as permit conditions that guide how ski areas are operated in harmony with the goals of A&R and in support of the lands and wildlife resources that we seek to protect. Mr. Austin also indicated that there have been efficiencies created in the permitting process because of our longstanding work with the department. So we agree that efficiencies can happen, particularly in the master planning process when looking at the big picture, planning for future development, management, and conservation. And conservation or planned conservation of larger parcels of land is more predictable for us and preferred in contrast with piecemeal conservation in the context of permitting individual projects. Master planning is a lengthy and expensive process for ski areas to undertake, but they view this positively as proactive and necessary work. Businesses really like certainty, and the ability to plan is how ski areas achieve good outcomes. They increase their certainty by creating a framework for individual projects to reside under, as well as a framework to ensure that the ski area, the local community, the region, and the state have a vision of and agree on the goals and preferred outcomes. So looking now to the future, we've seen that A&R's scope of review and their resource tools have been evolving, and a lot of focus is now at the landscape level of the largest forest blocks and connecting habitat. And this is a much broader view, and this bill would direct A&R to prioritize land conservation in the future to meet the goals of the bill. And this creates uncertainty for ski areas, and it would be beneficial for us to understand how the agency will prioritize areas for conservation and make sure that we participate in any stakeholder process. This is the same observation we've made when we've talked about forest fragmentation during prior legislative sessions. And it's unclear how A&R and other stakeholders will prioritize lands for conservation and protection, because if we look at A&R's maps of forest blocks and connecting habitat right now, the land area identified is very large and even includes some ski areas. So just like in a ski area's master planning process, we need to have a vision of the state's conservation goals and an understanding of the plan to get there. So in closing, we do support the broad goals of H126, but would advocate, number one, that the widest array of conservation programs and tools should be available to reach these goals. And two, advocate for a process in which we would participate, where stakeholders can have input into how we will focus our collective efforts to determine how lands are prioritized for conservation, either through permanent conservation or in other ways like regulatory processes. And right now, that future vision is unknown and something we hope that H126 could help to create and clarify. So we're advocating for a process where stakeholders can work with the state to create more certainty around where these lands are that we want to protect and how we can work to get there together. Thank you. Answer any questions or try to.
Thank you for your testimony. Do members have questions? Representative Torrey.
I actually just have a comment. I want to thank you for your testimony, because I feel like you clarified a lot about the goals of this act. And I think a lot of people have been confused because of that landscape view. And we are going to be taking more testimony as we go on to learn more about the wide array of tools that exist now. So yeah, thank you for putting it in those terms that are accessible.
Thank you.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a bill somewhere in the House right now to preserve country clubs, golf courses from development. Are you familiar with that at all?
I have read it, but I have not. I would need to go back and look at it.
I don't know how many ski areas have golf courses. I know Jay does. And I just wondering what your take was going to be on that. You're not.
Yeah, I would have to look at it again, I think. Yeah.
I'll ask that another time. Then.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
I'll go back and do my homework.
Okay.
Say that was constructive testimony. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for your testimony.
All right. Thank you for your time.
So we have Amber Perry.
Good morning. Thank you for having me today. My name is Amber Perry, and I'm the Vermont Farm Bureau Policy Director. We just have some language concerns with H-126. The first one being on page 6, line 5, long-term. The term long-term concerns us. We also are concerned on how this will impact the forest land that is currently in current use programs. We also have seen that the bill is being submitted for review, or the plan is being submitted for review to the following committees: House Ag and Food Resiliency, Forestry, House Environment and Energy, and Senate Natural Resources. And we would ask you to consider bringing Senate Agriculture in as well. We support the idea of the initial inventory of permanent conserved land here in Vermont. We also would support the summary of conservation practices, especially for all private landowners. On page 8, lines 19 and 20, we would like to thank you for the addition of private owners of forest land and agricultural lands. That is all we have for today. We'll be looking for language changes, and we look forward to coming in if need be later.
All right, thanks. Can we rewind to your very first question or concern, page 6, line 5?
The long term,
I might have the wrong draft up here, but
the area, but that is subject to long-term sustainable forest management.
for concern.
Low term, long term.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Representative.
Chair, can you is it that it's unclear what long-term means? Is it that there is concern that it could be forever, or
Yes,
what?
that is the concern, that it could mean forever.
Page numbers. Representative Bongar.
And just to be clear, you do recognize that this is all about willing landowners making the decision.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Other questions? Thanks for your testimony. Next up, we have Sam Lincoln. Welcome, Mr. Lincoln.
Thank you. Morning, all. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, testify on H-126. For the record, my name is Sam Lincoln. Because I don't represent an organization, I'm here as an individual today, as a rural landowner and a rural forest economy business owner. Just a brief background about myself and my family's business. I own and operate a master logger certified logging operation in central Vermont. Part of a multi-generational family that owns farm and forest land. We've been dairy and cash crop farmers, loggers, maple producers. And my wife's family also has operated a sawmill. At their peak, my agricultural enterprises have done business with up to 80 farmers a year, dairy, beef, and equine farmers. I've worked on timber harvesting projects for over 50 individual landowners in the last 25 years in central Vermont. Many of them repeat clients during that time. 3 of them past former legislators. And as part of that, generated millions of dollars in revenue for my business and for those landowners. And I would conservatively estimate that I have spent 16,000 hours working in the forests of central Vermont. I served 6 years on the Development Review Board in Randolph, following a year and a half on the Planning Commission. I served as a private sector representative on the Forest Fragmentation Study Committee for Act 171 in 2016. In 2017, I was appointed by Governor Scott to serve as Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, working on forest economy policy, during which time I reviewed Vermont conservation design and provided feedback to the authors. Though there are many subjects I would enjoy the opportunity to speak about with you all, I would like to discuss the stewardship of rural land and defining conservation in relation to the goals of H-126. To be clear, right up front, I support land conservation in the many different forms and the goals of Vermont conservation design. I recognize that H-126 is a plan to achieve voluntary conservation, and it's not a mandate. I have concerns about how the plan is to be developed, starting with landowners. Looking at the maps of Vermont conservation design and where the priority areas are, I believe it's important to recognize that the millions of acres on the landscape that are under private land ownership, and they're undeveloped in a wide range of shapes and sizes. There are many forms of conservation and easements and ownership, but millions of those acres remain what I would refer to as conserved land due to the stewardship ethic and culture of rural Vermonters. These parcels of land have been transferred from generation to generation by people who saw the highest and best value in the land as working it and conserving it. That's the reason that it is ripe for conservation today, is because people for generations and centuries have seen value in it, not with buildings on it, with managing it. As science, awareness, outreach, and education has evolved, these landowners also recognize the value of this land for biodiversity and its ecologically important areas. My sons will, and my wife's and my sons will be the 5th and 9th generations respectively from our families to own land in Vermont. And we don't, we consider our land to be conserved because it's part of our family culture and ethic. Adding values to the commodities raised on the land has that centuries-old track record with remarkable progress and without the need for permanent restrictions on the land. The forest landowners that I work with have several characteristics that I've understood over the past 25 years. They are enrolled in the use value appraisal program. They have many goals for management of their land other than generating revenue from timber sales, but the income is important consistently to all of them. They make decisions about their land use based on practical information and best practices that they've learned from interactions with a licensed consulting forester, the county forester. They may have been to a Vermont Woodlands Association walk in the woods, a Vermont Coverts retreat. They've read or learned about ecosystem protection from a source they trust. They've enrolled in a USDA program that incentivizes wildlife habitat enhancement. They want and need flexibility within best practices and within their bundle of private property rights to make decisions that work for them. They're paying mortgages on the land, they're paying taxes on the land, and they are an incredibly important part of land conservation. The witness list for this bill so far has included many talented professionals, but I have seen very few private landowners, and without their participation and buy-in, this level of conservation can advance, and particularly if it's voluntary. I encourage the committee to hear from landowners across Vermont about the challenges they face and how they would implement these goals. The concepts in H126 do not appear to have been drafted with private landowners' needs in mind, which I believe is a significant oversight. The word landowner only appears 2 times in the draft, once in the findings and once in the development of the plan. I believe that asking for landowners to provide input through a comment period or during 3 public meetings, so another entity, another body can draft the plan for the conservation of their land is not respectful to the multiple generations that people have made this millions of acres of, kept this land undeveloped. If I was tasked with that, I would re-situate the chairs at the table in the planning process. The economics of land conservation. Planning for the cost of conservation at this scale is not addressed in the bill. Tax assessment for permanent conservation of the land at this scale is not addressed in the bill or directed to be addressed. Talking about sustainable forest management. As you heard Bob Zano say, the most efficient way to achieve young forests and create the habitat is through forest management, which works in conjunction with how landowners have already been sustaining and managing their forests for generations. Implementing sustainable forest management is not a switch that can be flipped on and off. It requires massive capital investment, diverse markets, and a very skilled workforce. The forest economy supply chain that enables this type of management is undergoing significant disruptions, both economic and natural, and this implementation tool is at risk. I encourage you to look to the work of the Forest Futures Roadmap that is currently charting out those issues and potential solutions as part of the a bill last year. When we're discussing land use and the conservation categories, please remember that the output of sustainable forest management activities are the forest products that are manufactured into essential human needs. Traditional building materials, food packaging, medical supplies, energy for homes and institutions, an endless list. And we learned at the beginning of the pandemic just how essential those products are when supply chains started being cut off. Not producing them here losing the raw material supply only externalizes the use and consumption of that resource to another part of the globe. Not cutting trees here does not result in a net decrease of cutting trees on the planet. Landowners are receiving $27 million a year annually in stumpage payments for forest management activities, which has in itself an indirect conservation effect. Forest management activities in Vermont with the highest standards of sustainability and ecosystem protection during planning and implementation. Public lands, timber sales, and timber harvest that include chip harvesting for wood fuel are currently under threat in other policy discussions. Regarding the definition of sustainable forest management, my request is that that term would be defined by the Commissioner of Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. I encourage the committee to look at other model programs in land conservation. For example, public and private conservation work, such as Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, Vermont Land Trust, and many others in that conservation category. They give landowners wide lanes to make choices and work alongside them in choosing best practices. I'd also encourage you to take a look, and I'll send it in my notes to the committee assistant, that the Watershed Agricultural Council in New York is a program that is provides the protection of the drinking water supply for New York City 9 million residents. And that watershed protection was developed because they clearly knew that they could not go buy up all the land needed to protect all that water. They couldn't conserve it all. So there's research done, there's outreach, technical assistance, and direct conservation programs that are done in that watershed, and it has improved the viability of the working lands enterprises there through cost share programs and practical research that helps those business owners be more viable economically and logistically. I encourage you to take a look at that again as a model program that becomes a very large win-win for the participants. I also encourage you to look at solutions that work for landowners at their kitchen table. When they've reached a permit office to apply to subdivide their land, we've lost the battle. The landowner, people are not greedy. I literally in 25 years, I think I've done 2 house lot clearing projects. The rest of it has been for landowners that want to keep their land undeveloped and managed, but they need money. There's large holding costs, things like that. Please consider things, as you consider these things, look at conservation subdivisions that allow landowners to maybe have a higher density, smaller lot sizes, putting the subdivided parcels that they need some cash equity out of their land, but also allow larger blocks of land to be conserved and create access for forest management, agricultural management, or there may be some of these other categories you've defined in here. With that, I'll pause and thank you for the opportunity to present my information and take questions happily.
Thank you for your testimony. If it's possible for you to submit the written testimony as a follow-up, that would be great. So
I will.
we can refer back to it. Thanks. Representative Stebbins.
Thank you, Manager. Thanks, Mr. Lincoln, for coming in. So we have 2 places in here that basically say how this is going to get done. I mean, it's fleshed out more than 2, but basically it says the secretary shall develop this plan. And then it also says in developing the plan, the secretary shall hold, as you mentioned, not less than 3 public meetings on the plan and accept public comments. The secretary shall solicit input from various stakeholders, including private owners of forest lands, ag lands, land trusts, Vermont Housing Conservation Board. So my question is, 2-part. First, are you aware of the effort that started this past summer with VHCB pulling various stakeholders together to start thinking about this and looking at that? And if you are, does that process feel like a real process for input from landowners? Because I think that is, at least what I've been thinking, just me, 1/11th of the committee, is that would be sort of somewhat the process that this bill might continue to work along.
I'm not, I'm very familiar with VHCB. I'm only loosely familiar with what the conversation you're talking about. I probably think the only way I could appropriately testify to that is that VHCB is a vehicle in Vermont that has obviously done the conservation work and also the technical assistance work that goes down to the boots on the ground producer level, helping the viability of those farms. Somewhat of a, not necessarily a mirror of the Watershed Ag Council in New York, but similar. So, but to your direct question, I don't think I'm familiar enough with that effort to say, to give you an informed response.
So just a follow-up, I guess, I can understand your concern in terms of how this is drafted. And I guess there's always a balance between how much language you put in as to what the process is in reality. If you don't mind, could I like connect you with the person who's running that and maybe hear from you about whether or not that seems like an appropriate path? Because we definitely need to have private landowners as part of this conversation. It's clearly cannot be, a secretary going off and looking at some plans, which it wouldn't be. But I just want to make sure that we're making it clear enough that we would be hearing from landowners.
I'd be very happy to.
Okay, thanks.
A couple of just maybe points of clarification. The definition for sustainable forest management did come from the previous commissioner.
That is-
We worked this through last year. Yeah. That's actually, I think I heard you say planning for cost of conservation at this scale is not accounted for. Actually, that is one of the points of this is, the way that I envision this is that we are currently investing in conservation, and the groups that are actively participating in doing conservation kind of already use Vermont conservation design. The overarching goals are the conservation of 80% of Vermont species. And so it's less about like a priority list. It's not going to be that scale of a plan. It's really a touchstone plan for the legislature to say, this is really important. We have this, where are the gaps? Literally, where are the gaps? The biophysical region gaps, which were referenced in the previous witness's testimony, and acknowledge them sort of like eyes wide open. How much will it cost for us to keep a functioning landscape for future generations? But that's the way I envision this coming across.
If I may, is there a reference to that accounting for that cost? I guess I missed that. There's a
deliverable in the plan, and it may need more clarification.
Okay.
So I'm not discounting your comment because of that, but I welcome specific, clarification points.
Okay. Thank you.
No further questions. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Right. With that, do members have further discussion? I'm going to remind everyone, including myself, we're coming back at 1 today, not 1:15. I think that's today. Do I have that right? Yeah. 1 o'clock.
So I do have a question,
Okay.
and I apologize.
For witness, but for
Well, maybe for our witness, 2 of them brought it up, and I apologize for having a coughing fit there. Karen Horn asked about the sustainable forest management, why that definition is in there. Did we have, and Madam Chair, I don't recall if we had testimony about why that would be in there, how it connects to the rest of the bill. So we have definitions, we have goals, and then we have a plan, and now I'm going to start coughing. So how does that
that was
connect?
also added by the previous commissioner during testimony last year, the definition of sustainable. Yeah, page 6.
I'm on page 6, yes. I'm just wondering what is gained or lost in having that, how it's connected to the rest of the bill.
'Cause I think it's in the definition of the third category. Yeah.
Oh, to long-term sustainable forest.
So then the
management.
question was, what is it? And so then we defined
Yeah.
it.
Okay. Great.
That's where it comes from.
And, okay. terms of that definition and causing damage to other ecosystems, do we have, like, who would we hear from on that?
6.
Yeah, page
9.
6, line 10. So sustainable forest management. So who could we learn from about what type of forest practices cause damage to other ecosystems? I guess that's my question, better articulated. And have we heard? Should I go back and further testimony?
We could invite in the current commissioner.
Thank you.
All right, further questions or discussion? Not seeing any. With that, we will adjourn for the morning.